A huge issue that causes people to stay in the same rank forever despite experience is incorrectly diagnosing the problem. A lot of different tweaks can make a huge improvement, but this one is a game changer in every sense of the word. We're going to go over confidence, but not how to be confident. A lot of players are barking up the wrong tree and trying to solve the wrong problem. It could be that some of your mechanical problems and decision-making problems are actually more related to your confidence than anything else. It's important to know if you are one of these players, because solving a problem that you don't actually have is not going to do you any good. So this video is designed to help you identify whether you could improve your gameplay by becoming more confident, so you can start improving and stop wasting your time with the wrong issue. Many players don't realize that they are actually losing due to a lack of confidence, or they don't understand how much they can gain by being more confident. And if you are one of these players, it's important to recognize this because it can really be holding you back. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos designed to help you improve like this one. Hello everyone, my name is Atchax, and today we will be talking about confidence. The first huge issue from lack of confidence is uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to indecision. Indecision is lost time, and you leave yourself open to attacks in preparation. When you are indecisive, you can lose precious seconds, and in that space, you could absolutely lose a gunfight, miss an opportunity, or fail in strategy on the round-wide scale. And think about an attack where you hesitate for a couple seconds, give the defenders time to rotate, and lose a round. That's the sort of hesitations that you don't want to incorporate in your game. Most of the time, when you are stuck between choosing one option or another, you aren't entirely focused on what's in front of you, and if opponents attack you, you may not be ready. This is an attack in preparation. When you make decisions in Valorant, they have to be quick, at least in most cases, to be effective. Oftentimes, unconfident players are perfectly able to recognize the correct decision, but have trouble committing to it because of self-doubt. Confident players make their actions quickly when they perceive the correct one. They don't waste or lose time second-guessing themselves because they recognize the pacing of Valorant won't allow them that time. They take advantage of opportunities, listen to instincts more, and leave very slim openings for attack and preparation. The second one I see all the time is trying to prove oneself. A lot of comments go back and forth in all chat or even in team chat where players criticize, make fun of each other, and direct everyone's attention to their place on the scoreboard. These sorts of comments are often rooted in a lack of confidence because players are trying to prove they are the best on the server, which unless you're Radiant is often a waste of time. Whether or not a player is good is entirely relative to your standard, and your standard usually shouldn't be the server. In my opinion, that's too small a scale to be an accurate reading. If you're the average Valorant player, there are a whole bunch of players you are better than, and a whole bunch of players who are better than you. As such, arguing with some random stranger over who's the best player on the server is a complete waste of time. And you don't have to respond to people who try to make these arguments. Not contesting the argument is not going to make their point more or less true. If you're an unconfident player, you're going to tend to take these arguments to heart, and that's why I think a lot of people contest these arguments. So remember that these players aren't actually qualified to rate your gameplay. They haven't seen the height of your gameplay or the low of your gameplay, they haven't seen you play enough, and they probably don't want what's best for you either. Recognize that these opinions of your skill are not actually very valuable, and that you don't have to listen to them, and hopefully that you don't have to contest them. Some people often tell everyone why they got a frag or why not. These comments also tend to be rooted in a lack of self-confidence because these players will tend to try to prove that they aren't bad to the other team. Whether or not you are bad is completely independent of what the other team thinks of you. And once again, good is a very relative concept. If you are spending time in all chat for any reason other than a greeting, a GG, or a laugh, it's probably a waste of time and distracting you from focusing on the game. Telling the opponent you were flashed or typing no scope or that you lagged and that's why you died is pointless. That's valid info for your team to move forward and adapt, but generally speaking, the other team doesn't really care. That's not in an aggressive way, they're just impartial because whether or not you lagged isn't important to them, generally speaking. The actual typing isn't the real issue. The concern is mostly in the lack of confidence. A lot of these comments are validation-seeking behavior from a source that doesn't really want to offer validation or care about your feelings or want you to win and are in fact trying to win against you. There are a couple more issues with this approach. When players boast about how good they are, they build up an image of themselves that these same type of players will tend to feel the most pressure to live up to. It's distracting and tilting to argue with other players in Valorant, It's very bad for team chemistry to tell your teammates you are much better than them. And any of these mistakes can easily lose an entire game, and it's probably happened often to you, as confidence is typically a reoccurring issue. Confident players know their own skill level. They don't need the other team or their team to agree with them beyond practical purposes. They don't need to be mean because they will believe in themselves and won't need angry comments to win. They don't respond to comments against their skill and often ignore angry, aggressive, or pointless comments on Valorant because they are impartial and don't really take to heart what other players think of them. They don't allow these things to distract from their focus or negatively impact their confidence, which is a huge benefit. Moving forward, take notice of unnecessary or mean comments you may be making and ask yourself what your point was in saying that. It may well be that you were trying to prove yourself to everyone on the server. If you have been up to this point, that's okay. Just understand that you don't have to prove your skill level to anyone on the server. You can also start not responding to any comments that are pointless. And if you can't do that, you can try starting by not responding to any comments at all. You can form the generally good practice of valuing what you think of yourself above what others in Valorant think of you. It's very important to believe in yourself, as often no one else will do it for you. Lack of confidence tends to make players play a certain more cautious playstyle. A lot of the time in Valorant, a totally passive style can actually be more risky than a risky style. Let me explain. If a team always rushes with 5 players, confident players will know to make an aggressive play to close the net on the attackers and lock down a retake. Those with a totally passive playstyle may never push, and in doing so play right into the opponent's hands. If you never push anything on attack, then you will probably not be able to win. If a teammate pushes and you don't go with them to trade because it feels like a risk, you have made a strategical error and possibly cost your team an advantage while accomplishing absolutely nothing. There is nothing wrong with playing passively. The style born of lack of confidence tends to be entirely passive, because of a lack of belief in oneself. My impression is that some people don't believe in themselves at all to win, and so seek to avoid engagements as much as possible except for the easiest frags. This results in baiting, ineffective lurking, and other harmful gameplay elements that result in a loss. In addition, total passivity is very rigid and becomes predictable and easily counterable very quickly, where players who aren't confident will not be able to adapt. And of course, against any strategist who recognizes rigid passivity, you should have a very harsh loss, which leads us into our next mistake. Unconfident players tend to overvalue wins, losses, and the scoreboard. These definitely mean something, but unconfident players use them as evidence for whether they are good or bad. One bad game, one win, one loss doesn't define anyone either way. The data is just too small. This leads us to our next error, which is allowing previous occasions to control you. Unconfident players get stuck on losses. They allow losses to create more uncertainty, feeding a negative loop of lack of confidence leading to loss, and loss leading to lack of confidence. If a basketball player misses a shot, they ought to entirely forget about it and move on. Dwelling on the past mistakes during a game is just going to take away from their focus in the moment, which is going to detract from their gameplay. If you make a mechanical error, you should forget about it and move on. Focus on the moment, not your past mistakes, because in a Valorant game, the moment is what counts. You can't win a gunfight that already happened, but thinking about that past fight could cause you to lose the ones that haven't happened yet. If you are a strat caller or managing your team's macro strategy, you do have to think about these things, but only objectively, with the intent to develop an effective strategy, not to criticize yourself. You've probably seen a theme so far. Unconfident players seem to be obsessed with how good they are, whether or not they are good, or proving their preconceived notion of whether or not they're good. However, as I've talked about, that's completely relative, and it's very hard to judge or quantify that. So why bother worrying about it? This struggle is internal, and it distracts from the external struggle that is playing out in the game, which disrupts focus and distracts from actually being good. My recommendation is to replace that question of whether or not you're good with a goal, and then try to improve until you hit that goal. That for you should be a lot better feedback than whether or not you are good, because whether you are good will change depending on who you're playing against, how much sleep you've had, what sort of headspace you're in, if you're having an off day or are on fire, what map you're playing on, what agent you're using. The list goes on and on and on. And so having a direction to move in to guide you is probably going to be more beneficial for you than obsessing over an unimportant and distracting question that is completely irrelevant in the long run and can change at any time. But the worst thing about lack of confidence and that question of whether or not you're good, as we'll talk about later, is that lack of confidence leads to stagnation, which means you aren't improving, and that is far worse than simply not being good. If you're not good, you can improve. But if you have a mentality that actively prevents you from improving and you aren't improving, then that means that you can never be better than you already are. Which is such a shame because there's a lot of room for growth. You really don't want to block yourself off from that growth because you'll never reach your full potential and you'll never know how good you truly are. Lack of confidence also leads to a disproportionate inability to win clutches. Confident players know that aiming is no more difficult in a 1v3 than a 3v1, and they are focused. Unconfident players often react negatively to increased pressure, often perceived, and create something called the imaginary audience. Definitely look for someone to explain the imaginary audience better than I can, because while I can understand it, it's definitely difficult to explain. But the imaginary audience is basically exactly what it sounds like, and this combines very poorly with lack of confidence. Essentially, a player feels as if everyone is watching them while also not believing in themselves to win, which feels very uncomfortable and makes them nervous while anticipating failure. This is a nasty combination and rarely works out in a player's favor. Unconfident players give up too soon. These players often have a hierarchy in their head of players who are better and worse, when in reality everything is more three-dimensional. It's more like each player has a variety of strengths and weaknesses, and learning to exploit these weaknesses and negate those strengths will allow a worse player to beat a better player. I often win more of the second part of every half than the first because I develop my strategy to adapt as the game progresses and as such win later rounds. Valorant is round-based and comebacks are very real and in my experience reasonably common. You have to understand this and be adaptable. Being able to play many agents, playstyles, tempos, timings, strategies, and mentalities is possibly the greatest strength. A Valorant game is only over on 2 occasions, when one team reaches 13 or when one team gives up. Teams I've played against give up after a few early losses, and I'm always curious why 0-3 is such a devastating score. It's basically nothing. You can make that back in 3 rounds. Make sure not to give up, because it's only over when one side has 13 or when you decide it is. You'll notice multiple reoccurring factors throughout many of these various problems. Lack of confidence results in uncertainty. This uncertainty and doubt leads to players not making certain advantageous actions in an effort to play safely. When they are finally forced into engagements, lack of confidence ensures these often go badly. Their rigid mentalities often reduce them to unadaptive, one-dimensional players, making them easy to counter, and lack of confidence makes these losses more significant than they are, resulting in an early victory for an opponent. These losses feed more into a player's lack of confidence, resulting in a cycle of negativity that keeps the player stagnant and prevents them from ranking up. You'll notice everything negative seems rather self-inflicted. Many players have the skills they need already. Their lack of confidence is just preventing these skills from manifesting. With many of the detriments from lack of confidence covered, let's move into the specific issues. I will also talk about some of the things that held me back from being a good player and some of the things that helped my confidence grow. Part of confidence is letting go of fear of failure. What are you afraid of? Public speaking and sports usually aren't life and death situations, and neither is Valorant to my knowledge. So what if you mess up? It's one part of one match of one game. A lot of the pressure and the uncertainty is from fear of messing up, and that's why we talked about the chat system earlier. A lot of people fear disappointing their teammates or the opponents thinking they are bad, when in reality, these don't matter and you shouldn't let them impact your own image. Random players in Valorant don't know you well enough, haven't seen you play enough, and are altogether unqualified to have an opinion of your skill, although constructive criticism can be helpful. Of course, this fear doesn't go unanswered. A lot of the time, the reaction to this fear is to be stagnant, to only do what is perceived as safe actions. As I have talked about before, playing Valorant safely is often the best way to not win, and it gives your opponent something entirely consistent and predictable to easily counter, and if you happen to come against players who naturally counter passivity and you don't adapt, you will lose. Stagnant players don't try new things, and they don't evolve. How are you going to rank up if you literally don't change? How are you going to become the best if you don't adapt? Like I said, I don't mind sharing my experience if it can help someone develop more confidence, but keep in mind that my tips worked for me. You may need something different. You should be the judge of that. Here are my different lines of reasoning. You should understand that most mistakes in Valorant will be very inconsequential. Unless you're a pro player, Most mistakes are just one part in one round of one game, and in fact, you can learn from the mistake and not make it again, which makes it more valuable to actually make the mistake in the long run than to avoid the mistake in the short term. Expect mistakes, even as you try to minimize them. Also understand that you don't have to be the best player in the server. Oftentimes, more adaptable players will beat out better players. I personally use strategy to compensate for mechanical disadvantages such as a slow reaction time, which is the thing that I'm working on right now. Know the value of other people's opinions and each individual win and loss, as it's easy to overestimate the value of these things. Understand that playing safely is actually not the same thing as playing for the win, and you need to play for the win if you want to be the best player you can be. As far as clutching goes, having measured regular breaths has helped me stay calm in a lot of clutches. As a result of these guidelines, I rarely feel pressure from anyone but myself to perform well. I usually don't fear making errors, and I understand that the safe play for your character may not be the best move for your win in Valorant. If you want to develop more aggressive styles, try entry fragging. You'll make a lot of mistakes and die a lot. You'll also develop a lot of beneficial skills along with variance and adaptability. And it happens to be quite fun, at least in my opinion. You can also just mute the entire opposing team if you want to form the good habit of not paying attention to them. The next issue is uncertainty. This can feel like something some people have and some people don't, but you can consistently build confident habits, and I think that is the center of making actions confidently. You have to trust yourself in Valorant. A lot of unconfident players have good instincts but ignore them. Start trying to listen to those. Developing skills that make you better is great for confidence. The only reason that I haven't mentioned that so far is that confidence can block a player's natural talent, so many of them have more skill than they know. Also, understand that you really don't know how a scenario will play out. That's not where high-level certainty comes from. You can only trust in your ability to deal with the situation, not the outcome. You can trust in your ability to win. You can trust in your ability to overcome and adapt in Valorant. Here's something to try and see if it works for you. Commit fully to any action first, and back out if provided an adequate reason during the action. It is not indecision or wishy-washiness before you make an action. That sounds like a small difference, but it can be absolutely huge. Uncertainty also blocks automation. Automation is when your brain automates tasks, often through muscle memory, where you don't have to consciously think about something. Automation allows you to do things faster and gives you more space to think about other things, which should mostly be tactics in Valorant. Have you ever forgotten how to walk? If you pay way too much attention to simple actions, it can interfere with your ability to actually do the actions. This impacts clutching especially, but also normal things like aiming, moving, using abilities, or pushing a sight. Stop dissecting mechanics like movement and aiming when you aren't trying to improve something specific, such as your counter-strafing or crosshair placement. Instead, just leave it to automation and focus on strategy and decision-making, as these demand a lot of mental space. For many players, it's not difficult to keep confidence going, but it can be difficult to take the first few steps and break the loop because it feels so dangerous. Let's talk about how to break that loop. The way I bridged the gap was to make a conscious decision to be confident, and my gameplay has been on a whole new level ever since. If you don't want to try that, make small, simple actions in Valorant to improve confidence by forming good habits. Unbind the scoreboard so you can't see how many deaths you have and play freely. Mute the entire opposing team right at the start of the match, and if you have a mic, maybe unbind the type chat key. Learn all the agents. Play the entry frag role or force yourself to be the first on the site. Take a game to not think about decisions in Valorant, preferably an unrated or spike rush, because that will almost definitely go badly. The point is to break that loop for long-term gain. Since you aren't used to it, you'll make bad decisions and mistakes in Valorant. But if you never take that leap, you'll never evolve. Which sounds safer to you? Never progressing, or a few mistakes and unnecessary deaths in Valorant? Have the confidence to escape the comfort zone in Valorant. Once you do, you may find you're playing a whole different game. I hope you find some value in this video. If you can, share how you are confident in Valorant in the comments below. Best of luck everyone, and I will see you in the next video.